Welcome. It is Verdict with Ted Cruz, Week in Review. Ben Ferguson with you, and here are some of the big stories that you may have missed as you were celebrating Christmas with your family and your friends. First up, Wall Street Journal is now reporting there's massive fraud in the U.S. government. Like we didn't see that coming. But they're even admitting now it's worse than you could ever imagine. We'll have the details of that for you in just a moment. Also, Minnesota fraud costing taxpayers billions of dollars. And what we're also being told is the fraud, well, it's not going away anytime soon. So how do we stop it? We'll explain that as well. And finally, the media and the liberals got it wrong. Economic data looking great for the GDP report. And the media is now downplaying it, trying to act like it never even happened. It's the Week in Review, and it starts right now. All right, Senator, I want to move to another part of this story, and it's bigger than Minnesota. We were talking about the fraud there, but the Wall Street Journal came out with a very interesting report, and I think it's worth us taking a moment to talk about it. It's the biggest fraud in welfare, and it just talks about how much abuse there is in the welfare system that's costing hundreds of billions of dollars to American taxpayers.
Well, and in particular, what it talks about is bogus bookkeeping that covers it up. And this is an op-ed that was written by Phil Gramm and John Early. Phil Gramm was previously senator from the state of Texas. He's an economist. Phil is a good friend of mine. And it's an important op-ed that he wrote December 17th in the Journal. It's entitled "The Biggest Fraud in Welfare. The Government Gives Tens of Thousands of Dollars in Benefits to the Poor, which it doesn't count as income." And so this is, in some ways, an accounting story. And please don't go to sleep right now, particularly if you're driving. Don't go to sleep. It is an accounting story that matters. So here's what Phil Gramm wrote. "Something is profoundly wrong with the U.S. welfare system, a problem that runs far deeper and is more dangerous than the shocking fraud in Minnesota that has been making headlines. Across the past half century, America has seen what in any other country would be considered a golden age, in which lower-income households have made incredible progress. Despite the end of our post-war economic dominance around 1975, the country's real per capita gross domestic product grew by 142% from 1974 to 2024. More than two-thirds of U.S. households have inflation-adjusted incomes today that would have put them in the top one-fifth of households in 1967. So, used to be the top one-fifth of households in 1967. Today, more than two-thirds of U.S. households have inflation that would put them there. 62% of all children who grew up in the poorest fifth of all households in the 70s and 80s worked their way up to a higher income bracket as adults, some all the way up to the top quintile. Yet, even as our economy has experienced broad-based growth, real federal welfare spending has soared by, what do you think the number is?
I'm going to guess 70%.
765%.
Golly.
More than twice as fast as total federal spending, and now costs $1.4 trillion annually.
Incredible.
Were that money simply to be doled out evenly to the 19.8 million families the government defines as poor, each household, how much do you think each household would receive a year if you just took all the welfare payments and sent a check to each household?
Directly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to guess in the thousands.
More than $70,000 a year for
Tell
each
me
household.
Tell me that's not a perfect example of government waste when you could just send direct checks of $70,000 a year to people.
The source of this dramatic mismatch is a fraud built into how various programs determine welfare eligibility. The government doesn't count any refundable tax credits or benefits that aren't paid in cash as income to the recipients. Some claim this is appropriate because the beneficiaries aren't free to spend non-cash benefits on whatever they like. But that is a specious argument because money is fungible. Receiving Medicaid, for example, frees up cash that would otherwise be spent on health care, allowing the recipients to spend the newly freed cash on other things. Non-cash benefits aren't in the end that different from income, except that salaries are taxed while government benefits aren't. And if individual welfare programs often don't even count benefits paid in cash as income for the purposes of gauging eligibility, The government's failure to count its largesse as the recipient's income allows welfare households to blow past the income level above which a working family no longer qualifies for government help. Take a single parent with 2 school-age children who earns $11,000 annually from part-time work. The government considers this household in poverty because its income is below $25,273.
Yeah.
But this family would qualify for benefits worth $53,128. It would receive Treasury checks of $3,400 in refundable tax credits and $4,400 in refundable earned income tax credits. Would also receive food stamp debit cards worth $9,216 a year, $9,476 in housing subsidies, $877 of government payments for utility bills, $16,033 to fund Medicaid, $3,102 in free meals at schools, and $6,624 in temporary assistance for needy families. All this puts the family's income at $64,128, or 254% of the poverty level. And look, the point, Phil Gramm goes on this, but the point is, when they're measuring income, they exclude all the welfare and benefits that are going down, and then they measure income and said, look how poor people are, without counting the money that is going out the door. And by the way, this also contributes to the massive fraud we saw in Minnesota because the Democrats in the federal government and state government are just focusing on shoveling cash out the door. And they're not focusing on how do you actually ensure any accountability, or even more importantly, how do you get people off welfare? Look, one of my favorite phrases is that the social safety net should be a trampoline and not a hammock. And by that, what it means is listen, many people have get down on their luck. They need help. But the entire focus should be to get you back on your feet. The entire focus should be to spring you out of the safety net and get you where you're working, where you have a job, where you're providing for your own family. You know, there's a dignity to work. You look at families that are trapped in generational poverty, one generation after another, and you lose the self-respect. You know, one of the amazing successes of welfare reform, one of the amazing successes of the first term of Trump that saw over 7 million people go off food stamps and go into the workforce, is that 7 million people that get to experience the dignity of work. I mean, that's literally a single mom who comes home from her job and is carrying 2 bags of groceries and puts those groceries on the kitchen table. And she looks at her kids and she has the self-respect of knowing, hey, I'm providing for you. And the kids look at her and know that my mom is providing for you. Look, God created mankind, I believe, to work and to be productive and to make a difference and to provide for your family. And this welfare machine that the left is so invested in traps people in dependency. And you're not doing anyone a favor by making them dependent on government. Instead, you're sapping them of the path to the American dream.
Now, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation, you can go back and listen to the full podcast from earlier this week. Now on to story number 2. Senator, there's another big story that I want to get to, and that is the out-of-control fraud. We have now got a number, and it could go higher. At least $9 billion was looted from the Minnesota Medicaid programs. Plus, there was welfare fraud as well in a bombshell report coming from the Wall Street Journal. This does not look good for the governor there. And a lot of mayors have now sent him a letter saying, we are in trouble and it's your fault.
Look, the level of fraud we're seeing, welfare Medicaid fraud in Minnesota, is staggering. It is an order of magnitude greater than we've seen. And here are the basic facts. Federal prosecutors alleged Thursday that Minnesota may have lost billions of dollars to fraud in its Medicaid program, the latest development in an ongoing investigation. As much as half, 50%, of the roughly $18 billion Minnesota has spent since 2018 on 14 Medicaid programs, particularly vulnerable to abuse, may have been siphoned off by fraudsters, according to U.S. Assistant Attorney Joe Thompson. Thompson made the remarks as prosecutors announced additional charges in the ongoing investigation of the staggering industrial-scale fraud engulfing the state. Quote, "The fraud is not small. It isn't isolated. The magnitude cannot be overstated. What we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes. It's a staggering industrial-scale fraud. It's swamping Minnesota and calling into question everything we know about our state." The level of it, half of Medicaid for years, that's in Minnesota. By the way, if you watch the corporate media, you've seen very little about this. They don't want to cover this at all because it is the complicity of the Democrats in office. And understand, Minnesota is a one-party state. It is governed by Democrats. Democrats are in charge. They looked the other way. Why did they look the other way? Well, much of this fraud was carried out by Somalis. We covered in a previous verdict how the single largest contributor to Al-Shabaab is a radical Islamist terrorist organization in Somalia. The single largest contributor to Al-Shabaab are the Minnesota taxpayers. That's the level of the theft that went on. And Democrats, elected Democrats in Minnesota, they happily looked the other way. Why? Because they were buying votes. And you know what? If they actually watched the taxpayer dollars and didn't let the criminals steal it, well, somebody might be upset if they had even the tiniest modicum of scrutiny. It is shocking.
Well, and you mentioned something a moment ago, and that is that the media has not been touching this. Luckily, local media has. CBS, for example, locally in Minnesota, they did a report on this that was just kind of throwing their hands up in the air like, this is so egregious. We need you to know. The national media, completely silent, no accountability for the governor there or those in leadership under him. I want to play this for people. This is, again, the local CBS affiliate there talking about the fraud crisis. Take a listen.
Minnesota's fraud crisis is growing. Today, prosecutors charge more people for billing the state for social services they did not provide. The federal prosecutor says it's possible half or more of the $18 billion billed to 14 programs since 2018 is fraudulent. We have team coverage, starting with Jonah Kaplan with more on what we've learned about these latest charges. Jonah, so we've gone from maybe $1 billion to possibly $9 billion or more?
Well, we've heard from the new U.S. Attorney, Frank, that we're not even at the end of the beginning of this investigation, and now we know why. Feeding our future was just the tip of the iceberg.
The fraud is not small. It isn't isolated. The magnitude cannot be overstated.
Prosecutors on Thursday indicting 6 people, including one already charged in another case. The 5 new defendants are all accused of defrauding a state program meant to provide housing assistance to the disabled and those dealing with addiction. 2 people charged aren't even from here. According to officials, Anthony Jefferson and Lester Brown came from Philadelphia to Minnesota looking for an opportunity to make money. They set up 2 fake companies and collected $3.5 million.
This is an instance of what's essentially fraud tourism. Mr. Jefferson and Brown were residents of Philadelphia who had no connection to Minnesota, except for they heard that Minnesota and its housing stabilization services program was easy money.
The state already cut off the housing stabilization program because of suspected fraud, but it's one of 14 social programs now under federal investigation. Together, they billed $18 billion since 2018. We asked how much could have been fraud.
You know, I don't make these generalizations in a hasty way. So when I say a significant amount, I'm talking on the order of half or more, but we'll see.
One of the new indictments accuses a fraudster of exploiting a program to help children with autism. Court documents say Abdinajib Hassan Youssef used some of the $6 million he stole to buy a Freightliner semi-truck. Governor Walz in a statement said he applauds the new indictment, saying, quote, "This is exactly the type of strong action we need from prosecutors to ensure fraudsters are put behind bars." Frank, this is not going away anytime soon.
I love the end there. Frank, this is not going away anytime soon. Well, if Democrats have their way and the governor, this will just be like a one-time report and then we just move on. And hey, if it goes from $9 billion to $12 billion or $15 billion, who knows where the number could end? And that was what they were referring to there at CBS Local. They're like, hey, we went from $1 billion to $9 billion And that may not be the final number.
Well, and Tim Walz says he applauds the indictments. Well, my question is, where was Tim Walz? Where was the governor? He was like, where's Waldo? He was popping up everywhere he could. He was following Kamala Harris on the campaign trail, but he was not actually doing his job as governor. And listen, there is a political reason. And Ben, I'm going to make a prediction right now.
I love it when you do this because usually you're right. So pay attention, everyone.
Okay. As horrific as this fraud is in Minnesota, and it is staggering, it is historically bad, I'm going to make a prediction that it is worse, that there is even more fraud in New York, California, and Illinois.
So you don't believe this is an isolated incident to there? Follow the money.
I do not. I think in bright blue states where the Democrats control all of the levers of government, all of the machinery, I think the same incentives that cause the Democrat politicians in Minnesota to try to buy votes by allowing people to rob the taxpayers blind, I think those exact same incentives are playing out in New York. I think those exact same incentives are playing out in Illinois. And I think those exact same incentives are playing out in California. So I'm calling on the Trump administration to audit every state, but start with the big blue states, because I think that is where you are most likely to find the fraud, where the pattern is the same. And I gotta tell you, people like Gavin Newsom are sweating right now. They don't want anyone looking at the fraud in California because the incentives are identical, and I suspect you're going to see the very same pattern playing out over and over and over again.
You know, you mentioned that they don't want you looking. There was a very interesting playbook. When Democrats get in trouble, they usually just start playing the race card, throwing down on the race card. Tim Walz had a press conference, and he was asked about the fraud in the Somali community, the money going back to the terrorist organization Al-Shabaab, and how much just total pure corruption there was. And then he was asked about ICE raids in Minnesota. He's obviously against that. They are a welcoming state, as he describes it. They're a sanctuary state. And what Tim Walz had to say back, it really did kind of make me laugh because it's so predictable, and yet it's the classic playbook they've been using. You question them on anything they get wrong, they're like, oh, well, you're a racist, a bigot, a homophobe, xenophobe, the list goes on and on. Well, now it's white supremacy if you actually enforce the law of the land with illegal immigrants in a state. Here's how he put it, Tim Walz in Minnesota.
So this is what happens when your own federal government wages war against you. This is what happens when they target communities for their own benefit. This is what happens when they scapegoat. And this is what happens when they no longer hide the idea of white supremacy. When you hear the Vice President of the United States talk about now white people won't have to apologize for being white. That's never happened once in my whole damn life. And I think everybody in this room knows what they're doing. So we're here today to say enough of this. We're here today to stand that Minnesota will protect their neighbors.
Minnesota will protect their neighbors, and this is what happens.
And rob them blind.
And rob them blind. $9 billion that we know of, right? And he says we're no longer going to allow them to hide the idea of white supremacy. When you hear the vice president, I mean, this is the classic Democratic playbook. Don't look at what I'm doing. I'm going to yell, "You're a racist."
Like he has literally overseen the biggest recorded fraud in U.S. government history. Not just a fraud on the taxpayers that defrauded the taxpayers of Minnesota, that defrauded the taxpayers of every state, federal taxpayers, but also that saw the federal tax dollars diverted to illegal immigrants, to Somalis who sent it to Al-Shabaab, a radical Islamic terror organization. So it's fraud funding Islamist terror. And what is Tim Walz's response? To scream white supremacy, white supremacy. At some point, those talking points get a little tired, and it's a clear and transparent effort just to avoid any accountability and to avoid being held responsible for what he allowed to happen.
As before, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation on this topic, you can go back and download the podcast from earlier this week to hear the entire thing. I want to get back to the big story, number 3 of the week you may have missed. Senator, there was a Christmas gift that was given to all Americans. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. It didn't matter if you were black or white or Hispanic or anything else in between. We got some new economic data, and it was, I tell you what, if there's anybody that had coal in their stocking, it was the media. There was an article that came out by the New York Times predicting the complete opposite of what GDP reports showed. Of course, they're not going to retract it, but they do look like idiots. And again, you got to ask yourself this question. Are they really willing and wanting to hurt Americans? They want Americans to suffer just so Donald Trump looks bad? Because that's what their reporting seems to look like.
Well, listen, the news that broke just this week is the economy is booming, that the latest GDP numbers show 4.3% GDP growth, which is terrific GDP growth. And let me read from the Wall Street Journal. Consumers power strongest U.S. economic growth in 2 years. A long-delayed government report shows third quarter GDP grew at an annual 4.3% rate. Robust spending by U.S. consumers drove greater than expected economic expansion in the third quarter, and the strongest growth rate in 2 years. Gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced across the economy, rose at a seasonally and inflationally adjusted 4.3% annual rate from July through September, the Commerce Department said Tuesday. The report was delayed nearly 2 months by the government shutdown and looks back at the period before the shutdown was in effect. It does, however, offer a snapshot of an economy that has managed to keep humming along for much of the year. Growth picked up from 3.8% in the previous quarter and easily beat the 3.2% forecast among economists polled by the Wall Street Journal.
That's big, by the way.
It's over a point higher than expectations. That's a big deal. As the Journal said, it was the strongest expansion since the third quarter of 2023. Rising consumer spending was partly driven by health care, including outpatient services, and at hospitals and nursing homes, international travel, legal services, and spending on products like personal computers and software also contributed. Artificial intelligence-related spending helped too, though the pace of growth appeared to cool from the second quarter. Overall business investment growth slowed to 2.8% in the third quarter from 7.3% in the prior 3 months. This is great news. And listen, when GDP is booming, what that means is it means there's more jobs. It means there's more productivity. It means the stock market is going up. It means people's 401ks are going up. It means wages are likely to rise. And so GDP growth, it's not always immediate. Are there still people struggling? Yes. But GDP growth is driven, and I'll tell you, one of the things we're seeing is the Christmas spending numbers are very, very strong. And so that's one of the signs of consumer confidence that, you know, if you're worried, if you're scared about not being able to pay your rent or your mortgage, then you don't necessarily go out and do some big shopping for Christmas time.
We saw the record-breaking numbers on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and that was as the Democrats were saying that we were in a tailspin and this was a disaster of an economy, and they were trying to say Donald Trump is ruining your Christmas. I'm like, well, the data says that people, as you just mentioned, they're going out and spending at record numbers on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, so that tells me that someone's lying.
That's exactly right. And here, I want to show you talked about the press being dismayed. And I got to say that the corporate media is utterly corrupt. They are dishonest. I just want to read to you two tweets. The first tweet is from October 30th, 2024. Now, what was happening right after October 30th, 2024?
The election, presidential.
There was a presidential election, and who was president in October 2024, at least nominally?
Well, the auto pen, but if you want an actual person with a heartbeat, we'll go with Joe Biden.
Okay, so here's what ABC News tweeted October 30th, 2024, 1 week before the presidential election. Just in, the U.S. economy grew at a robust 2.8% annualized rate in the third quarter, slowing slightly from the previous quarter, but continuing to dispel any concern about a possible shutdown. This report comes just ahead of the presidential election. All right, so that was a year ago. Now, that was 2.8%. What do you think ABC News said about 4.3%?
What was it?
Just in. The U.S. economy expanded more than economists expected over a recent 3-month period, recording robust growth despite concerns about sluggish hiring and cash-strapped shoppers, federal government data showed. So, 2.8% is robust and fantastic, and yay. 4.3%, well, we're really worried about sluggish hiring and cash-strapped shoppers. And yeah, okay, I guess it is like almost twice as high. But damn it, we don't like those numbers. I mean, that is not news. And I literally, whoever wrote that tweet should be fired. Like if ABC pretended to be a journalist, you'd say, okay, go work for the DNC because you want to be a partisan parrot. That's who they are, and it's why people don't trust the news. Now, I want you to listen to Kevin Hassett. Kevin Hassett is the head of the National Economic Council in the White House. Listen to Kevin talking about these recent GDP numbers.
You know, it's a fantastic report, 4.3%. It's just about as good as GDP numbers get. And especially coming, on the heels of the CPI report, Consumer Price Index report we got, which you actually showed some interesting data that it's consistent with, that showed that core inflation is all the way down to 1.6%. And so I think that these numbers are showing that President Trump's trade policy and his supply side policy, which is really increasing factory production and so on, is having a big effect, as is his trade policy. So if we abstract from the reduction of the trade deficit, then the 4.3% number would only be 2.6%. So Trump's trade policy is really working as well.
You notice they mentioned trade policy because that was one of the other big lies this year in 2025, which is the shelves were going to be empty at Christmas. The toys you wanted for your kids were going to be not on those shelves. You're not going to be able to afford basic things. Half of the stores going to be gone at Walmart and Target and Costco and Sam's Club. None of that happened. And they said there was going to be massive spikes in prices for everything that you couldn't afford. Again, that didn't happen either while we collected record number of tariffs and cash. The president's trade deals seem to actually be working and the leverage seems to be working. And they don't want to admit that this has not been a disaster.
Well, listen, there's still some volatility when it comes to trade policy. And as you know, I've been advocating that the president uses trade policy as leverage to open up foreign markets, and he's been doing that. That has been very, very successful. This also underscores basic supply-side principles that when you cut taxes, as we did, and when you repeal job-killing regulations, as President Trump is doing, it results in more investments, more jobs, and the economy's booming. This is basic cause and effect.
As always, thank you for listening to Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Ben Ferguson with you. Don't forget to download my podcast, and you can listen to my podcast every other day you're not listening to Verdict, or each day when you listen to Verdict afterwards. I'd love to have you as a listener to, again, the Ben Ferguson podcast, and we will see you back here on Monday morning.